I'll introduce you, Daniel Domscheit-Berg, now of OpenLeaks, used to be with WikiLeaks, and from a journalist's perspective, if you would like it or not, you made history. So, because I think in the whole WikiLeaks debate, which especially in Germany, but also, of course, in America, became an either-or debate about various aspects, I think one thing was a little bit lost, that WikiLeaks is one part of a broader movement, and that this is the start of a new phase of the web. So if you say the Web 2.0 changed technology and communications, I think now we're reaching a new phase where the web has the possibility and is already starting to change society and politics. Would you agree with that, or is that too much of an outsider view?
No, I actually totally agree with that statement. So I think if there's one achievement that WikiLeaks has made, beside whatever publication has been made or whatever documents have been published, it is that there is a cultural change that is happening now. We have experienced completely new possibilities that technology intersecting with society offers to us. We have experienced what is actually possible, what boundaries can be pushed. And it is a very important debate that has been spawned, which is that debate about what are secrets and what is information that should not be secret. So the whole debate about where do we have a right for something to remain secret, and where do we have a right to break that secret, is, I think, at the core of one of the fundamental questions we have to answer for the future.
How do you answer that? I mean, transparency or the giving up of secrets is, of course, at the core of this, but there's, like, I think, various transparency debates going on right now about the web. So where is your part of the transparency debate, contrary to, for example, when you talk about Facebook, there's a lot about talk about transparency as well, but I think the word has various meanings.
Yes, so I think this is very important to differentiate, and it might be good that we elaborate on what actually is meant by transparency within this session. So what Facebook or similar sites create is a transparency of the individual, where we are sort of abandoning our privacy in a way that whatever we do, who we are connected to, who we talk to, all these things become very transparent. But for me, there's no real value addition in that for society as a general. It might help us to communicate better with each other, to stay in touch, to exchange our ideas. But the transparency that we were looking at, that we were working on, is a transparency where there is something that is immoral, that something that might be a lawful wrong, that has to be exposed. And this is where WikiLeaks or similar efforts can help in fostering transparency where it is actually refused by entities. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, a pretty important distinction in between the two.
What you mainly do now, also with OpenLeaks, which we will come to in a minute, is you create tools that can enforce transparency in a way that's probably historic. I mean, the question of transparency has been around since the fairy tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, but now you have the possibilities to create transparency like never before. So when you have these tools which are per se neutral, how can you guarantee that these tools are used in the right way, not in the wrong way?
Well, yeah, this is why a couple of the people that worked with WikiLeaks, including me, had left the project in September last year, and we are going into a new direction with our OpenLeaks project. So basically, I think what is very important is that society is leading this discourse, that we all talk about why we need more transparency, what is acceptable to us as a world, as a society, and what is not acceptable. So this very central question is something that we have to define for the future, for our society to grow in a healthy manner. And the only way to answer that question, if that question can ever be answered with a very hard answer, like a definite answer, this can only be answered if we make use of diverse organizations involved in answering that question. So we need a very diverse set of people that are leading this debate. We need to carry that debate into the heart of our society. We need to talk about this with people that have experience in that. We need to involve organizations and entities that have experience in all these things. So that is why we, with the OpenLeaks project, we are trying to foster all of the experiences we have and combine these experiences in a union of interest in finding an answer to that question.
But isn't then the debate right now about transparency that revolves around Google Street View and Facebook, isn't that almost distracting from a greater topic in society that is much more prevalent and will be much more effective?
I think it is.
Right.
So the problem is that there's one word that is being used. So allegedly, I unfortunately haven't seen the talk yesterday, but there was a talk that mentioned radical transparency in combination with social media networks. So for me, radical transparency means something completely different. So the word transparency is not connected to social media at all. And this whole debate about all of us giving up our privacy, or to what extent is it okay to give up the privacy, to what extent do we have a right to our own opinion, and how much we give up this privacy, how much data we give to others, if Google Street View can just take pictures of our houses, all that stuff. This might be important, but it's really not as important as the whole debate about the wrongdoings that are happening in the world, about all the secrets that are being kept from the public that we should know about in order to take better decisions. So there's a different quality in between these two topics.
But if you have created a tool and it is used in a political setting, that tool is not neutral anymore. And the web has created a space in society and in politics that has no precedents, no historical precedents, so there are no rules yet. So how are the ways you can come to a new set of rules that are also enforceable?
I think the answer to that is that you have to, if you just provide a tool and you provide this tool non-discriminate to anyone that wants to use that tool, then this is a neutral approach that you're taking. And this is very important. It is important that this tool, by the ones that provide the tool, does not get abused as a political instrument, but that rather existing organizations can make use of that tool and maybe pursue political goals with that. So there's a big difference in between that, because the tool itself is not political, does not follow a political agenda. So that in the same way, it was very beautifully said yesterday in a session upstairs, that if you provide a technology, that technology remains very powerful if it is neutral, and if you do not use it for a specific purpose, but if you just open it up to everyone that wants to use that technology. And that is basically what we're trying to get at with OpenLeaks. So we're not going to restrict it to partnering with media that we think do good stories or that come from one political spectrum or another. But we're actually trying to distribute this technology to as many diverse partners that we can find, and by that make sure that the bandwidth of organizations using that tool balance each other out. And that is, I think, the only way to solve this whole dilemma that we're in.
So bear with me, and maybe can you dumb it down for me, who's not so knowledgeable in the actual technology which is very sophisticated, that use in WikiLeaks. I mean, I started to read around it, and it's not just a simple website mechanism. So what were the actual mistakes, both technically but also politically, that were made in the WikiLeaks phase? What were the mistakes that made you leave WikiLeaks?
Well, that's a very broad question, and unfortunately we only have 25 minutes for this very important panel here, but I'll try to answer it shortly. So what we perceived is that WikiLeaks is, I think, trying to be too much at once. So it is trying to reinvent the wheel in a lot of ways. It is trying to answer a lot of questions about what can be published, for example. How do you publish information? What has to be redacted in some ways? all these things it's trying to reinvent in a way. And on the other hand, there's this whole topic about being able to accept material from anonymous sources, which I think is not answered yet, or had not been answered before. So the core functionality, the core new thing that WikiLeaks provided was the possibility for anonymous sources to submit a document to an entity and remain anonymous. So in the same way that any source can just print out a document, put it in a brown envelope and mail it to a newspaper or an NGO, they could do this online and still remain anonymous. That, I think, is the innovative part about this whole idea, and this is a mechanism that society needs. Now, because WikiLeaks is doing all these things at once, it has a lot of control about, first of all, how it handles material that is being submitted, who it is partnering with, when it is releasing these things, and all these are political questions. And the moment you have to take these decisions, you become a political player or an actor in a political sense. And that is something we'd like to avoid. And this is why we just want to provide that technology, the technology to be able to protect sources, to accept information that anonymous sources give, and open up that technology for all the existing entities that have an interest in receiving such information. So we are not, that's very important as well, we are not trying to be the answer for all the organizations in the world out there. So we have a limit of how many partners we would want to have. It's actually a pretty low limit, I think. But we are in the same time putting up all the experiences we make and all the knowledge we gather into an open knowledge database, so that all these other projects out there that have a similar interest can just use that experience, that knowledge, in order to do something similar or to even reproduce what we are doing. So in the same way that WikiLeaks is too centralized, we do not want to be centralized in just a different fashion, but we'd actually like to decentralize that whole topic as much as possible, diversify it.
So that would mean you become more of an idea and a concept at the core of a movement than an organization.
Yes, it is just a tool that this idea, which is so inherently important for the future, namely being a mechanism to expose wrongdoings in the world that others try to keep secret at whatever cost, that we just provide tools to deal with that issue.
So one of the main points of criticism towards WikiLeaks was that there is kind of a fundamentalism about this transparency, and that it's very radical. I mean, I'm sure you had to counter that argument as well. So how do you answer that?
That's precisely my problem. There were many occasions where we were facing questions about what can be published and how can you publish something without, for example, invading someone's privacy, without exposing something that has no value addition for the ones that learn about it. And that question cannot be answered by a single person, and it cannot even be answered within a single organization, I think. And this is why it is so important to diversify that field again, to make use of all the experience that media outlets, that NGOs and other entities have collected over decades, and make use of that experience in order to approach that question a bit more responsibly.
So, for example, I mean, the Afghanistan papers that were released, I think, were very important because they did clarify a lot about the Afghan war, but there, like in a concrete case, was the rumor that the Taliban is already reading the leaked documents to find out who the informants are. So would there be mechanisms that can avoid something like that? I mean, I guess it didn't happen because the news was not followed up with actual the consequences. But
well, as much as I am aware, from the beginning of partnering with media organizations, the three media organizations at that point in time, so Der Spiegel, the New York Times, and the Guardian in the UK, all of these three organizations had asked for a harm minimization process. They had put it as a constraint to making that deal to say that there has to be a process where all of these records are screened and whatever harming information in them that would pull in individuals that had nothing to do with that war, so that would be dealt with. And actually, I think that just shows that these organizations are aware of the core of this problem, which is that at some point in time, as much as you support transparency and as much as you want to expose wrongdoings, you might have to restrict some of the information because it has no value addition for anyone. And that is, I think, a pretty clear example of why it makes sense to make use of that existing experience.
You said you want to broaden the scope with OpenLeaks, so not
Yes.
just tackle political subjects and not just work with media outlets. So where will you broaden that scope to? I mean, who will you work with as partners, if not media, and what other topics would OpenLeaks be a tool for?
Well, so generally, this is all not definitely answered yet, just because we are still in the progress of creating this whole project. So we have an interest in working with entities who have an interest in informing the public. So we're not going to offer any whistleblowing mechanisms for corporations or stuff like this, where internally in an organization, people could inform their employer that something's going wrong in their department or so.
Right.
So we're just going to partner with organizations that want to inform the public. And I think in that scope, we're not yet limited. So we're going to start within the next few weeks a testing phase with 6 partners. These are small outlets, just because we need to make some first experiences, finish some development of systems. And as soon as that has happened, we can open it up for a much broader audience, or for many more partners that can come in. But that again is something we're not getting hurried or anything. We're taking one step at a time. What we're aiming at is a long-term and sustainable project, a mechanism that will help the world in the future. And so we're not rushing into this.
So do you think WikiLeaks just really went to... I mean, they're celebrated as heroes. Assange is either reviled or celebrated. Was that too fast? Because it was it seemed to be such a historic push and open up so many channels.
I really think that the idea was too good to get it perfectly right in the first approximation you take. So I'm quite certain that we've been overlooking some of the problems too, and at some point in time in the development of what we are doing, some problems will arise, and we'll maybe find out that the design that we thought about has an inherent flaw, and so the next generation has to arise. But this whole conference is about updating our reality, and I think that is part of it as well. You have to stay flexible, and you have to be able to define new requirements that the future brings that you can't identify today. It's not about an ultimate answer, it's more about being the next approximation to a good mechanism there.
You also work with, also through your wife, you work with the concept of open government, which I think is it's not as dramatic, it's not as sensational, of course, a process, but will something like OpenLeaks also be part of a kind of an open government movement? And can you explain briefly what open government is?
Well, there's a big difference in between these two topics, because open government is something you do deliberately. That is what a government decides for themselves, where a government actually stays in control of the transparency process. And what a whistleblower does, or where you create transparency bottom to top, is whenever an entity, for example, a government, refuses to create that transparency by themselves, and someone feels obliged to shed light where someone is keeping something in the dark. So,
but isn't it two different parts of one thing? Isn't it kind of like almost like pliers who are forcing society from above and below?
Yes, it is.
To open up.
It is basically aiming at the same thing, which is that people should have a right to more information, to better information, and it's two different approaches on creating that good information basis.
And how do you deal with another topic that was always at the core of the debate? How do you deal, for example, with diplomacy? Diplomacy has, since ancient times, lived by the rules of secrecy. And if you look, for example, at the Cuba crisis, I mean, if there wouldn't have been secrecy in the backroom talks between the Americans and the Russians, there would have been nuclear disaster. So where do you draw the line? Because on the other hand, there's also very shady deals going in diplomacy. And
yes.
I think that's also why this blew up, because this is such a controversial case. I mean, do you leave diplomacy alone, or do you force diplomacy to be more transparent?
You see, there's no definite answer to this.
Right.
This is why this whole discourse is so important. And I think it can only boil down to individuals in this world understanding their environment better and having a good moral fundament that enables them to make good judgments. So it boils down to, if you're spilling a secret, if you're talking about spilling a secret, it boils down to one individual taking that decision. Usually a whistleblower that is taking a decision to betray a secret. So it boils down to that individual's moral feelings and that individual's responsibility, the values that individual holds on taking that decision. And the only way you can approach that, I think, is by education. And that is why, that's one part, I think, which is important for the future too, is that we all learn to, as individuals, act responsibly. To have an understanding of the complexity of the world we're living in, to not do something just out of feeling like it in 1 minute, but rather do it with a genuine intelligence behind it.
But isn't that the point where technology is propelled into the realm of philosophy? Because I mean, that it becomes like a huge. I mean, there's such a huge mountain of questions now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that mountain of questions is very important, and it's very important that we don't ignore it or that we don't deny it or whatever, but that we do everything that we can to address this. And maybe one last thing, I believe that these questions are so important that actually the world is lacking organizations or entities that are addressing precisely these questions. So we have think tanks for all sorts of stuff, but we do not have a think tank to address the core of these issues and to deal with redefining the future and our boundaries for the future in that sense. And here for Germany, at least, I can say that within the next few months, we're going to start a foundation that is supposed to deal with the whole topics around transparency and whistleblowing and finding a few answers, at least, to a couple of these questions.
If you're founding a foundation that comes to the subject of money and finance, because I mean, you do need financing for a project like that. So, how do you sort out where the money comes from and if that steers you in a direction or not?
Well, for the foundation, I guess that would boil down to not offering mechanisms how someone can buy himself into the board of that foundation or something similar. But I don't think that is practically much of an issue.
Do you see so for all these philosophical questions, do you see yourself as an accelerator for these questions with that technology?
I guess it's an enforcer for these questions, because there's just because these tools exist, you cannot avoid those questions anymore. And it's very important that you cannot avoid these questions, because just denying that they exist does not answer them, and they are too important.
Do you think, but then if you are enforcing these questions, do you think that do you have a feel if there's a difference if you nudge that process or if you turbocharge it? Do you know where the emergency brake is, basically?
Oh, well, this is why we're back again at this problem. WikiLeaks has accelerated that whole question to a point where now we're faced with a couple of situations, and we do not have answers, and we do not have structures that could find these answers for society. So this is a situation where we're kind of in a void at the moment. That void, again, forces us to act upon it. But I think the same as with WikiLeaks, it's always good if you take one step at a time and make sure that you build up good structures to deal with all those topics.
So to come to closing, I mean, OpenLeaks is going to go live soon. Is there a concrete date when you go live?
Not yet. We were planning to start the testing phase in January, but we've postponed it until sometime in February, just because we're in the background continuing some of the developments. There's a lot of conferences coming up. I'm quite busy with another project of mine that is distracting me, unfortunately.
That's your book.
Yes, that is that book project. So I'd like to close that as good as possible, bring it to an end, and also not, let's say, entangle these two different topics too much with each other, so that
Right.
someone could say that one is promoting the other. So,
But for OpenLeaks, if you go live soon, do you approach it now? Do you have definite goals that you could talk about now already, or is it basically, do you approach a whole process of creating these structures and answering these questions that is now ahead of you?
well, OpenLeaks is the technology part, so that is just providing these tools
Right.
to organizations, and that foundation part is hopefully that part which will answer some of the questions. So,
All right, this concludes the panel. I don't know if there's time for questions. Is there anybody there? I think a lot of questions from the first part of the panel will be answered in your book.
Yeah, well, just generally, I'll be around for the rest of this day and most of tomorrow. So whoever wants to talk about this important issue, whether this is the media or just people here at the conference that feel this topic is important, I'm generally available for whatever discussion and always happy to have a talk. So,
Thank you very much and all the best to you.
thanks.